Welcome to Merab Matters podcast, where combat sports, mindset, and real-life lessons collide. Hosted by Derving and Nate, we dive into jiu-jitsu, wrestling, MMA, and the grind that shapes athletes inside and outside the mat. Every episode we bring stories, strategies, and raw conversations that fuel growth, resilience, and community. Stay tuned because it's more than a fight, it's a lifestyle. Welcome back to Man Matters podcast. I'm Derving, and today we're doing something a little different. Usually, you've got me sitting here with Nate, going back and forth, talking about fights, talking about predictions, and generally making each other just arguing. Sometimes sounds silly, but today Nate isn't here, so you're stuck with me. And honestly, that's probably dangerous because we got a lot to talk about today. We got UFC 330 coming out to Philadelphia this Saturday. We got Islam Makhachev defending his welterweight title against Ian Machado Garry. We have seen the UFC embedded. We have seen all the ways. We have seen all the build to the fight. Also, another fight that we have for this weekend is Mackenzie Dern versus Gillian Robertson for the strawweight title. We got Edson Barboza potentially fighting one of his final fights of his career. We got some really interesting stylistic matchups throughout this card. We got Shavkat Rakhmonov sitting at home watching the guy he beat fight for the UFC championship. And then, because apparently the world of MMA wasn't already weird enough, Mark Zuckerberg is out here sparring with Merab Dvalishvili on a barge in the middle of the lake. I'm not making that up. This is a world we live in. So today we're going to break down UFC 330. We're going to talk styles. We're going to talk betting favorites. We're going to identify the fights that you absolutely need to watch. We're going to talk about whether Ian Machado Garry actually has a realistic chance against Islam. We got going to talk about Bella Mir heading into Dana White's Contender series. We're going to talk about Shavkat and whether he's become one of the unluckiest contenders in MMA. We're going to talk about Mark Zuckerberg training with Merab. And we're also going to have a much more serious conversation about the tragic passing of former boxing prospect Prichard Colon. Because sometimes combat sports give us incredible moments. Sometimes they give us ridiculous moments. And sometimes they remind us just how serious this sport really is. So grab your coffee, grab your headphones, and let's get into it. Because this is Man Matters. And let's start with the obvious one. The fight everybody's talking about. Ian Machado Garry versus Makhachev. Welterweight championship, and Islam comes into this fight as a pretty significant favorite. We're seeing him around a minus 350 to minus 370 range, while Garry is sitting around a plus 270 to plus 290, depending on the sportsbook. And honestly, I understand the odds barely sometimes, but I also think there's an argument that Garry is underestimating Ian Garry. Anyone that steps into the cage for a championship fight has a chance to win. That's the 1% that makes it more interesting about fights. Also, because if you just look at the resume, Islam has obvious advantage. He is 28-1. He's running an incredible winning streak. He was already a champion at lightweight. He moved up to welterweight, and now he's defending another belt after he beat Jack de la Madalena, which is ridiculous. But Garry isn't just some guy who wandered into the title fight. He is 17-1. He beat Bella Muhammad, which used to be Islam Makhachev training partner at one point. He also beat Carlos Prats, which is a Muay Thai guy. Bella Muhammad, he might be a little bit wrestler, but he is not Islam Makhachev type of wrestling, even though they train together. And the only guy who beat Ian Machado Garry is the guy who we're going to talk about later, Shavkat Rakhmonov. So let's talk about the actual matchup, because this is where it gets interesting. Islam's biggest weapon isn't necessarily one individual technique, it's the chain. That's what makes him so difficult. He can strike into a takedown. He can threaten a takedown to create a striking opening. He can take you to the cage. He can switch from single leg to double leg. He can ride. He can pass. He can submit. And if you defend one thing, he's already moving to the next thing. That's what makes elite grappling so frustrating. You're not defending a technique. You're defending an entire system. And that's something I think casual fans sometimes miss. People see the takedown and think, okay, he got him down. No, the takedown is only the beginning. Islam doesn't just want you on the ground. He wants you to put you in the position where every escape creates another problem. You try to stand, he follows. You turn, he takes your back. You expose your arm, he's stacking it. You create space, he's passing. You stay flat, he's controlling you. That's a nightmare. And Garry has a completely different game. Garry's game is built around distance. He's long, he's awkward, he's comfortable fighting at range. He can use straight punches, he can kick, he can move, and he's very good at making opponents chase him. Another secret weapon that Machado brought for this camp was he brought one of the best grappler, not just MMA, but jiu-jitsu overall, in Demian Maia. So if I'm looking at this from Garry's perspective, the first thing I'm telling him is don't fight Islam's fight. That's a big mistake a lot of fighters do when they face him. Don't stand in front of him and try to prove you're tougher. Don't let him back you towards the cage. Don't throw combinations that leave your hips open. Don't make it easy for Islam to connect the striking to the wrestling. Garry needs to make Islam fight the distance where the takedown isn't easy. And there's another fascinating variable here, size. Islam is moving up from lightweight. Garry is natural welterweight. I don't know if some of you guys have grappled with people that were the same height as you compared to somebody bigger than you, because sometimes somebody is taller than you and trying to pick him up and take him down. That pickup they're trying to take him down doesn't really work as much when their legs still touch the ground. And some grapplers are wiry and hard to take down because that's the type of grappling they do. But the question here is, does size matter? And I think it does. But I don't think size automatically solves the problem. We've seen Islam deal with big, strong guys before. The difference is that Garry isn't necessarily going to try out muscle him. He's going to try to make him miss. He's going to try to keep him at the end of his punches. He's going to try to make every takedown attempt expensive. That's the game. Make Islam work, make him shoot, make him carry weight, make him reset, make him shoot again. Because here's the thing about fighting an elite grappler. You don't necessarily beat them by stopping every takedown. Sometimes you beat them by making every takedown cost something. Which that might be the playbook that Sean Strickland used against Hamza Chimaev. Every takedown that he had to spend energy, he had to make him think about it for 5 minutes, 5 rounds. And here's another crazy statistic. Islam's only professional loss came way back in 2015 against Adriano Martins. Think about that. That was over a decade ago. Since then, he's basically built an entirely different career. And UFC 330 could be another major piece of his legacy. If Islam wins this fight, his UFC winning streak reaches 17 straight, moving beyond Anderson Silva's 16-fight UFC winning streak. That's a massive legacy conversation, because at one point that number seemed unrealistic for anyone. And this legacy, it seems like a legacy conversation because eventually we have to stop asking, is Islam one of the best fighters in the world? Obviously he is. The question becomes, where does Islam belong historically? Lightweight champion, now welterweight champion, elite wrestling, elite submission game, elite striking, ridiculous consistency, and almost no one has been able to solve him. If the only person that came close was Volkanovski, and you see what happened to the rematch in that one. And one factor that might have caused that puzzle to almost solve was because it was a short notice fight with Makhachev and Volkanovski, but he was able to put a game plan together and knock out Volkanovski next one. Now, if Makhachev beats Garry, that legacy gets even bigger. We're potentially watching history. Now, on the flip side, forget Islam for a second. Let's build the blueprint for Ian Machado Garry. I'll give you 3 things. Number 1, distance. Number 2, get back up immediately when he takes him down. Number 3, make Islam work. Don't give Islam 5 minutes of control. If Islam take him down, get up, make him shoot again, make him carry your weight, make him work. And I think that second point is especially important because if Garry spends entire rounds underneath Islam trying to survive, he's going to lose the fight. He can't just defend. He has to make Islam pay for getting him down. He needs to create scrambles. He needs to force Islam to make decisions. He needs to make the wrestling exchanges exhausting. And then there's that psychological component. Can Garry stay disciplined? Because Islam is going to make him uncomfortable. That's inevitable. And when you're uncomfortable, you start making bad decisions. You overextend, you throw too much, you reach, you stand too tall, depending when you're taken down. And that's exactly what Islam wants. So I don't think this is necessarily an automatic blowout. I think Garry has a legitimate path. I just think Islam has more path to victory. So for the prediction, for this one, in my opinion, for this fight, I'm taking Islam. I'm going Islam by decision. I think Garry has moments. I think Garry makes Islam work. I think there will be stretches where Garry looks extremely good. But over 5 rounds, I think Islam's ability to chain wrestling together eventually wins the day. Garry has the size, he has the range, he has the skill, but Islam has too many ways to win. And that's why he is the champion currently and was a champion of welterweight. So now let's move to the co-main event, Mackenzie Dern versus Gillian Robertson, strawweight championship. And this one is fascinating because we're talking about 2 women who actually want to grapple. This is a striker versus grappler. This is a wrestler versus striker. This is, you want to grapple? Yeah, me too. Let's go. That's exactly why BJJ fans should be paying attention because the question isn't simple. Who's better at jiu-jitsu? It's who can impose their version of grappling. It's an incredible creative. She'll attack submissions from weird positions. She'll attack from bottom. She'll attack during transitions. She can create opportunities that aren't necessarily obvious. Meanwhile, Robertson is a little more methodical. She wants control. She wants position. She wants to slowly break it down. And that's a fascinating stylistic clash. Creativity versus positional discipline. Chaos versus structure. And sometimes those matchups produce some of the best grappling exchanges in MMA. Robertson is also coming in on a 5-5 winning streak. This isn't some surprise title opportunity. She earned this. But Dern is a champion for a reason. Now let's talk betting. Dern is a favorite. Robertson is around plus 185, and honestly, I think Robertson is one of the more interesting underdogs in this card. Not because I think Dern is bad. I don't. It's because the stylistic matchup is close enough that I don't understand the odds as much as I would in some other fights. I'm actually leaning Robertson, and I'm going with Robertson by decision. And if I'm wrong, well, that's why we make predictions. Because the beauty of MMA is that you spend 3 hours breaking down every possible scenario, and then somebody gets kicked in the head in 30 seconds. And there goes your prediction. So now, let's talk about one of my favorite fights on the card. Edson Barboza versus Esteban Ribovics. And I don't even know if I want to talk about rankings here. I want to talk about legacy. Because Edson Barboza has been doing this forever. This man has been producing highlight real violence for years. Wheel kicks against Terry Edom, body kicks that he did against Dan Hooker, leg kicks against his opponent, nasty switch kick, knees, spinning attacks against Paul Felder. Even one of the GOATs, the Eagle himself, Khabib Nurmagomedov, ate one of those spinning attacks, a spinning kick from Edson Barboza. He has some of the nastiest kicks I've ever seen in the UFC. And there's a Philadelphia connection here. Barboza fought Justin Gaethje in Philadelphia back in 2019. Now he's coming back to Philly years later, and that's pretty cool. But there's the problem with fighting a guy like Barboza. Even if he's older, the technique doesn't disappear, the timing doesn't completely disappear, and the power doesn't necessarily disappear. The questions become, can the body still execute the technique at the same speed? That's where Ribovics has the advantage. He's younger, he's aggressive, he's hungry, and he's not fighting Barboza's reputation. He's fighting the guy standing in front of him. That's important because sometimes younger fighters get caught fighting the legend instead of fighting the opponent. And that's how legends beat people when they're supposedly past their prime. They don't need to be the fighter they were 10 years ago. They just need you to make one mistake. And that's another story. Here, there's been a discussion that this could possibly be one of the final fights of Barboza's career. And that's a weird feeling because some fighters retire and you think, yeah, it's probably time. But Barboza, you almost don't want him to stop because you always feel like he's one kick away from creating another insane highlight. But sometimes fighters don't get to choose the perfect ending. Sometimes the sport chooses it for you. And if Barboza loses this fight, I don't think the question should simply be, can he still fight? The question should be, what does he want from the rest of his career? There's a difference. Now, here's where I think UFC 330 gets interesting. Because if you look at the main card, you might think, okay, Islam versus Garry is carrying this thing. But the prelims, there are some fights I really want to see. And I actually think some of these fights could be more entertaining than the fights in the main card. Geoff Neal was originally scheduled to fight Yukoni, but Alvarez stepped in at short notice, and that changes the matchup. Yukoni is long, he's a multi-guy, he has serious weapons in the clinch. Alvarez is extremely dangerous on the ground. So you get a very simple question. Does Yukoni keep the fight standing, or does Alvarez eventually drag him into the grappling exchange? That's what I'm watching. Next one, we got the return of the Tarantula, Jalin Turner versus Cowboy Fernandez. This is one of the sleepers picks for fight of the night. Turner has that long, explosive frame. He's dangerous at range. He's got serious power. Fernandez is technical and athletic, and this is exactly the kind of fight where I don't want to play because both guys can make something happen very quickly. Then we got Vicente Luque versus Tresean Gore. This was interesting because you got a veteran versus a younger fighter. Luque has been through wars. Currently now, this fight is at 185. At 170, he's fought elite competition. He got knockout power. He got submissions. Gore is younger and dangerous, and I'm actually interested in Luque as an underdog because when you got a veteran like Luque at a number where people are counting him out, that's when I start paying attention. Now let's talk about something that I know MMA bettors love. The giant favorite, Makhachev or Orbeli, is sitting around a minus 800 to minus 900 range, depending on the bow. Will I bet an MMA fighter at minus 900? Honestly, no. Not because I necessarily think Orbeli loses, but because MMA is chaos. You can dominate someone for 4 minutes and 50 seconds, like Sean did with Silva, and then you get caught. You can break your hand, you can get cut, you can get clipped, you can get submitted. That's why I think the question isn't will Orbeli win? It's is the price worth the risk? And that's a completely different question. That's something I want people to remember when they're looking at the betting lines. A favorite doesn't have to be bad fighter for the bet to be bad. Sometimes the fighter is almost too certain to win, but the odds are so terrible that the risk isn't worth the potential return. That's especially true in MMA. All right. Before we move on, I want to step away from UFC 330 for a second because there's another story I think our listeners need to know about. And this was especially interesting for anybody who's been following wrestling and MMA. Bella Mir. the daughter of former UFC two-time heavyweight champion Frank Mir. She's scheduled to fight on Dana White's Contender Series on August 25th against Alex Apodaca, with a UFC contract potentially on the line. And the first thing that jumps out is obviously the name, Frank Mir. Former UFC heavyweight champion, one of the most accomplished submission specialists in UFC heavyweight history. So Bella is going to have a spotlight on her whether she likes it or not. But here's what I find interesting. She's earned accomplishments of her own. Bella won the NCAA Division I Wrestling Championship at 145 pounds earlier this year. Think about that. That's not something you inherit from your dad. You don't get an NCAA championship because your father was a UFC champion. You have to go into that wrestling room and earn it. And that's what makes her MMA transition so interesting. She's also 4-0 as a professional MMA fighter, so there's a real foundation there. If you have elite wrestling, you got already developed one of the hardest pieces of MMA to build: balance, position, pressure, takedowns, scramble, body control, and perhaps most importantly, you understand what it's like to be exhausted while somebody is trying to take you down. That's a huge advantage. But here's the other side. Wrestling doesn't automatically make you a great MMA fighter. You still have to learn striking, kicks, distance, cage defense, submission defense, ground and pound, and how to deal with somebody punching you while you're trying to wrestle. That's an entirely different sport. And that's what's going to be, and that's why I'm going to be watching Bella. How quickly is she adapting? Because the athleticism is obviously there, the wrestling is there, the competitive experience is there, but MMA requires you to put all of those pieces together while somebody is actively trying to hurt you. And then there's the elephant in the room, her father, Frank Mir. Maya growing up with that guy as your dad. You got access to someone who understands elite level MMA. You've got someone who knows what it's like to compete at the highest level. You got someone who understands the mental side of the sport. That's an enormous advantage, but there's also a downside. Everybody is going to compare you to him. Every mistake you make becomes Frank Mir's daughter. And that's got to be difficult because Bella doesn't need to become a female version of Frank Mir. She needs to become Bella Mir. That's an important distinction. And then the one seems genuinely interesting in her potential. He's talked about her potential to compete across multiple combat sports disciplines, and he's been involved in her development for several years. That's unusual. Dana doesn't publicly hype every prospect as a future superstar, so that gets my attention. But here's the key word: development. He's only 23, just need to become UFC champion next year. She needs to keep improving, and honestly, how the UFC handle her development correctly. If she wins on Contender Series, don't immediately throw her to the wolves. Let her build, let her get experience, let her learn, because that's what makes Contender Series so interesting. It's not really can you win a fight. It's can you convince Dana White that you're worth investing in. You can win a boring decision and still not get a contract. It happened recently. One of the contenders that was this past few weeks. Have an insane fight and lose. Dana White might still sign you. So August 25th is going to be fascinating because this isn't just Bella Mir's next professional MMA fighter. It's basically a job interview, except the job interview involves getting punched in the face. That's Dana White's Contender Series. Okay, now we're getting into one of the stories that I think is actually bigger than UFC 330. Shavkat Rakhmonov. This dude is 19 and 0. And he's basically been unable to build momentum because of injury circumstances outside of his control. He missed all of 2025 because of a knee problem. Seems to be the I don't know if you heard that saying, you win the battle but you lose the war, because Ian Machado blew his knee. He blew his knee again after that, and he underwent surgery in 2026. His manager said he could be out roughly 9 months. He also have other things outside the ring that hinder his be able to come back. His wife and his son got in an accident. His father passed away, and his wife he's going through divorce too, and then dealing a knee injury. They posted a video of him doing rehab in that leg that had the bad knee. It looks extremely with muscle dystrophy, so I'm not sure he'll be able to come back. But his last fight was against Ian Machado Garry. Rakhmonov beat him 5 rounds decision. And now Garry is fighting Islam Makhachev for the championship. Meanwhile, Shavkat is watching from the sidelines. Imagine being undefeated. Imagine being a guy who is now fighting for the title. And then your body basically says, nope. That's brutal. And that's why I have hard time not feeling for Shavkat. Because this isn't just a fighter who lost. This is a fighter who got exposed. This is somebody who failed to capitalize. He's undefeated, he's winning, and injuries keep interrupting the story. So here's the big question. Does Shavkat still deserve an immediate title shot when he comes back? There are two ways to look at this. One, he's 19-0. He beat Garry. He has wins over Jeff Neal and Wonderboy Thompson. He finished his first 18 professional opponents before finally going to distance with Garry. That's a monster resume. But the other side is he's been inactive for a long time. The division keeps moving. Garry could become champion. Islam could beat Garry and move on. Other contenders are going to fight. So if Shavkat come back healthy in 2027, do you give him the title shot immediately? My heart says yes. My brain says maybe not. Because if you're the UFC, you have to keep the division moving. But if Shavkat comes back and beats somebody spectacularly, now you got a monster storyline. Here's the scenario that gets really interesting. What happens if Ian Garry beats Islam? Because then you've got a new champion. And the undefeated guy who already beat him, that's incredible matchmaking. And that's why Shavkat's situation is so frustrating. He's sitting there with one of the best records in the division, but the sport doesn't stop moving while you're injured. Okay, we need to talk about the weirdest thing I've seen this week. Mark Zuckerberg, Merab Dvalishvili, a barge, a leg, punches, kicks, some takedowns. This is real. Zuckerberg posted a footage of himself sparring with Merab on a floating barge. And apparently, this is even Zuckerberg's first rodeo. He's trained with UFC stars before, including Alex Pereira. He also won gold at a Jiu-Jitsu tournament in 2023. So let's be fair. He's not just some random billionaire who decided to put on gloves yesterday. The guy actually trains, but he's still Mark Zuckerberg. And Merab is Merab, one of the most relentless wrestlers in the UFC. So what exactly is Zuckerberg getting from training with Merab? A ridiculous amount of wrestling experience, because Merab is basically the human embodiment of I'm going to keep wrestling until you stop me. So that's an incredible training environment. If you're trying to understand wrestling under fatigue, Merab is almost the perfect person to train with. Now, there's a moment in the footage where everybody online is talking about Zuckerberg gets some offense, they're striking, they're grappling, and people immediately start saying, Zuckerberg is a beast. And I'm like, let's relax. It's training session. It's not UFC 330. It's not a sanctioned fight. It's not Merab trying to take Zuckerberg's head off. But here's what I actually respect. The guy's willing to be bad at something. Think about that. You're one of the richest and most powerful people on the planet. You're willingly stepping onto the mat with people who can choke you unconscious. That's humility. And that's actually one of the things I love about martial arts. Your bank account doesn't matter. Your job title doesn't matter. Your followers doesn't matter. You got tired just like everybody else. You get frustrated. You make mistakes. You get smashed. And then you have to come back the next day and work on it. That's what this story actually fits Man Matters, because there's deeper lessons underneath the joke. Martial arts are one of the few places where status gets stripped away. You can be a billionaire, you can be a CEO, you can be a celebrity, you can have millions of followers. And none of that helps you when somebody has a cross face and is trying to pass your guard. The man doesn't care who you are, and honestly, that's beautiful. We're going to change the tone for a minute because this is something that happened yesterday that I think we need to talk about. Former Puerto Rican boxer Prichard Colon has died at age 33. And if you're not familiar with this story, this is one of the most tragic stories in modern boxing. And I want to be careful with how we talk about this because this isn't just a boxing story. It's a human story. It's a reminder that combat sports have consequences that don't always show up when the referee stops the fight. Now, who was Prichard Colon? He was a highly regarded Puerto Rican boxing prospect. He was undefeated going to the fight that changed his life. His professional record was 16-0, and he had won 13 of those fights by knockout. He was considered one of the promising young fighters of the sport. Then came October 17th, 2015. Colon fought Terrell Williams at Eagle Bank Arena in Fairfax, Virginia. And what happened that night is still discussed today. The fight became increasingly ugly. Colon repeatedly complained about punches being landed to the back of his head. Those punches are illegal in boxing. They are commonly referred to as rabbit punches. And this is where things get really difficult to watch. Because according to reports and footage from the fight, Colon repeatedly tried to get the referee's attention regarding the shots to the back of his head. There were penalties during the fight. Colon himself was penalized for a low blow. Williams was also penalized for a punch to the back of the head. But the fight continued. And that's where I think we need to understand the fighter's mentality. Because a fighter isn't necessarily thinking, I need to protect my long-term neurological health. They're thinking, I need to survive this round. That's the warrior mentality. And sometimes that mentality can work against you because fighters aren't trained to push through discomfort. They're trained to not quit. They're trained to keep going. And sometimes that makes it incredibly difficult to recognize the difference between I'm hurt and I'm in danger. That's a distinction every fighter needs to learn. The fight eventually reached that ninth round. Colon was knocked down. Between rounds, he spoke with ringside doctors and reported that he felt dizzy. He was clear to continue. Then after the ninth round, there was a terrible sequence of events involving Colon's corner removing his gloves, apparently believing the fight was over. Colon was disqualified, and then he was held back towards his dressing room. That's where the situation became catastrophic. He began vomiting. He collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital. Doctors found a severe brain bleed. He underwent emergency brain surgery, and he entered a coma. 221 days. This is the day that gets me. That's how long Prichard Colon spent in the coma. 221 days. Think about that. He went to the hospital in October 2015, and this young man who had entered the fight as an undefeated professional boxer was now fighting for his life. He eventually emerged from the coma, but he suffered catastrophic neurological damage and remained in a persistent vegetative state requiring around-the-clock care. And his family spent years caring for him. His parents became his caregivers. His mother, Nieves, devoted years to caring for her son. His father, Richard, remained involved in his care and advocacy. And yesterday, August 13, 2026, Prichard Colon died. He was only 33 years old. And this is where I think we need to have the uncomfortable conversation. Combat sports are dangerous. That's not a secret. We know while we're watching, but the entire purpose of having referees, doctors, athletic commissions, and rules is to reduce unnecessary risk. The goal isn't to make fighting completely safe. That's impossible. The goal is to prevent a dangerous situation from becoming catastrophic. And that's why Colon's story is so important. Because when you look at everything that happened that night, there were multiple moments that make you ask whether the safety mechanism surrounding the fight worked the way they were supposed to. Colon complained about illegal punches. He was knocked down. He reported dizziness. He was still allowed to continue. And we can debate individual decisions forever, but we'll never know exactly what would have happened if one of those decisions had been different. That's the tragedy. And I think something else gets lost when we talk about tragedies like this. We talk about the fighter, we talk about the fight, we talk about the referee, we talk about the opponent, but what about the family? Because the fight ends for everybody else. For the promoter, the event ends. For the referee, he goes home. For the fans, they move on to the next fight. For the opponent, his career continues. But for Prichard's family, the fight never ended. They spent more than a decade living with the consequences of that night, and that's heartbreaking. And this brings us back to something we've talked about throughout this episode. Control, MMA, boxing, jiu-jitsu, they're all different, but they're all combat sports. And there's always going to be a risk. So what can we actually do? Better officiating, better medical protocols, better concussions recognition, better dedication, and most importantly, a willingness to stop a fight when the fighter's health is more important than the fight itself. Because nobody remembers the seventh round decision 10 years later. Nobody remembers whether the fight was exciting, but everybody remembers when someone's life changed forever. And this is where I want to bring it back to the philosophy behind this podcast. We talk about toughness all the time. Be tough, don't quit, push through, never tap, fight through the pain. There's a place for that mentality, but there's also a point toughness becomes something different. Sometimes the toughest thing you can do is say something is wrong. Sometimes the toughest thing a coach can do is stop the fight. Sometimes the toughest thing a referee can do is wave it off. Sometimes the toughest thing a fighter can do is admit that they are hurt. Because the goal for martial arts isn't to destroy yourself. It's to become better, to test yourself, to challenge yourself, and hopefully you walk away from the mat and live another day. And I think that is an important lesson for everybody who trains, especially those of us who love combat sports. There's a difference between discomfort and danger. There's a difference between being tired and being injured. There's a difference between wanting to quit and knowing you need to stop. Learning that difference might be one of the most important things martial arts can teach us. So today, we want to remember Prichard Colon for more than a tragedy. Before he became a story about brain injury, he was a son, he was a boxer, he was a young man with a future. He was an undefeated prospect with dreams of becoming a champion, and his family spent more than a decade fighting alongside him after that future was taken away. Prichard Colon was 33 years old when he passed away. Rest in peace. And our thoughts are with his family, friends, and everyone who supported him throughout that incredible battle. And that's something I think everybody watching combat sports need to remember. We can love the violence, we can love the competition, we can love the adrenaline, but the people inside the cage, inside that ring, they are human beings. And sometimes the biggest lessons isn't who won the fight, it's remembering what the fight can cost. All right, let's make it official. Rapid fire prediction. I'm going to run through some of the biggest fights on the card and give you my picks. Islam Makhachev versus Garry. I'm taking Makhachev by decision. Mackenzie Dern versus Gillian Robertson. I'm taking Gillian Robertson by decision. That's my underdog of the night. And Barboza versus Esteban Ribovics. I'm going to take Esteban Ribovics. I think the youth aggression are going to be difficult for Barboza to overcome. Yukani versus Yoel Alvarez. I'm leading Yoel Alvarez. I think the grappling could ultimately determine this one. The Tarantula Jalin Turner versus Kawi Fernandez. I'm taking Jalin Turner. I think his range and power could make the difference. Vicente Luque versus Trishan Gore. I'm taking Vicente Luque, veteran experience in a fight where I think people may be underestimating him. Makhachev Orbeli versus Jeremiah Wells. I'm taking Orbeli, but again, I won't touch him. at negative minus 900. Now, the dark horse performer of the night, not necessarily the biggest favorite, not necessarily the champion, who was the person who walked away from UFC 330 with people saying, okay, we need to pay attention to this person. I'm going with Trishan War. He's not the biggest name. He's not fighting for the belt. But if he beats Vicente Luque impressively, people are going to notice. My alternate is Esteban Ribovics because Ribovics knocked out. But if Ribovics knocks out Edson Barboza in Philadelphia, that's a statement. That's the kind of win that changes how people look at you. Now, let's connect all these stories because on the surface, Shavkat and Zuckerberg have absolutely nothing to do with each other. But I actually think there's a really good martial arts lesson here. Control what you can. Zuckerberg can control whether he trains, he can control whether he shows up, he can control whether he gets better, but he can control what people think about him. Shavkat can control his preparation, he can control his rehab, he can control how he responds to another injury, but he can control getting injured. Islam can control his preparation. Garry can control his strategy. Barboza can control how he approaches his next fight. But once that cage closes, you don't control everything. And that's one of the biggest lessons you learn in martial arts. Control what you can. That's a lesson that goes way beyond the gym. You can control whether somebody likes you. You can control whether your boss recognizes your work. You can control whether somebody respects you. You can control whether life throws an injury, setback, failure, and disappointment at you. You can control your response. You can control your preparation. You can control whether you show up tomorrow. And that's one of the things I love about jiu-jitsu. You get submitted, come back tomorrow. You lose, study it. You get promoted, keep training. You have a terrible day, show up anyway. Eventually, you realize that progress isn't about controlling the outcome. It's about controlling the process. And that's something I'm constantly reminding every day I step on the mat. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Mat Matters podcast. It's been a little different today. No name, just me. But honestly, sometimes that's okay. Because combat sports give us enough stories that you could talk about them for hours. UFC 330 is going down this Saturday in Philadelphia. Islam Makhachev, Ian Machado Garry, Mackenzie Dern, Gillian Robertson, Edson Barboza, Esteban Ribovics, a whole lot of interesting fights. We got Bella Mir getting ready for Contender series. We got Shavkat Rakhmonov waiting for his opportunity. We got Mark Zuckerberg apparently turning everybody of water into his personal MMA training facility. And we got much more sobering reminder of Prichard Colon and the risk that comes with the sports we love. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get another crazy moment that none of us saw coming because that's MMA. You can study the tape, you can study the statistics, you can look at betting lines, you can make the perfect prediction, and then the cage door closes and somebody gets to prove you wrong. That's what makes the sport so addictive. So before we get out here, I'll leave you with this question. Who leaves UFC 330 as the biggest winner? Not necessarily the person who wins their fight. I'm talking about the person whose career changes the most. For me, I'm watching Ian Garry because if he beats Islam Makhachev, we're not talking about Ian Garry as the contender anymore. We're talking about him as one of the faces of the UFC. And if Lan wins, we're talking about one of the greatest fighters of this generation continuing to build his legacy. That's what makes this fight so interesting. So guys, thank you for hanging out with me today. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you subscribe, follow, like, share it with somebody who loves MMA. Let me know in the comments who wins Islam Makhachev or Ian Machado Garry. And tell me who your dark horse performance at UFC 30. I'm Derving. This is Mat Matters Podcast. And remember, it's not just about what happens on the mat. It's about what the mat teaches you. We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to the Mat Matters Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and YouTube so you never miss an episode. Drop us a review, share it with your training partners, and keep rolling on and off the mat. Until next time, keep fighting, keep learning, keep growing.